Welcome to another episode of Beyond Bark, a podcast series shedding light on Barkcloth, a 100% renewable and traditionally significant textile that remains misunderstood and overlooked despite its potential as a sustainable fashion alternative. This podcast is brought to you by IGC, a creative conglomerate which advocates for environmental, cultural, and social justice through fashion, and is known for promoting the use of barkcloth in its fashion label. I'm Miss Karmali, and today I'm joined by Kenneth Muhangi and Elder Saalongo Senoga to explore the intersections of law, culture, and a growing threat of biopiracy to Indigenous materials in a globalized world. All right, welcome to both of you, and thank you for being here. I think I'm going to start the way we always start, which is by asking our guests to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do and what barkcloth means to them. So I think we're going to start with the Elder Senoga to hit us off. What does barkcloth mean to you, and what do you do?
Thank you, Ms. Karmali. I am honored to be a part of this. Thank you for giving priority to the barkcloth. It has for a long time been kept under the bed, in small houses behind the main house, and only reserved for burials and celebration of cultural rites. And then it's out of the whole picture. I am Saalongo Senoga Tamzade, a clan elder from the Civet Cat clan of the Buganda kingdom, the Ffumbe Clan. I am also a grand mentor with the Ubuntu Nation initiative, bringing together African elders, royals, and professionals to reconsider culture as a force for good. What does barkcloth mean to me? Well, I am barkcloth. First and foremost, the barkcloth is used when we are sending off a deceased relative. It is also used when we are ushering in a new heir. Not so long ago, we have had like about 6 Buganda clan elders transition or die in the last 5 years. And the one who was buried with the fewest barkcloths was buried with 120. They were the shroud.
Oh, wow.
Yes, no coffin, no nothing. We just wrapped the whole body in 120. An elder from the Ffumbe clan about 4 or 5 years ago, before COVID, transitioned, and we had to use 300 barkcloths. So the barkcloth is very central for our... In fact, it is also used in the naming ceremonies. It is used in so many ceremonies. So it is important, and it is close to my heart.
And you're wearing it very handsomely today. So it's not just for the dead, it's for the living as well, right?
It's actually more for the living than the dead. Keeps the warmth, chases the mosquitoes away, preserves the dead for posterity to find. When you find somebody who was buried in a barkcloth in enough barkcloths about 200 years ago, you'll find all those bones and flesh just dried in there.
Nice.
So it's a good thing.
Beautiful. Thank you. So, Kenneth, that leads us now to you on the other side of the coin, I feel. Would you like to introduce yourself and let us know what you do, and what does barkcloth mean to you?
Yeah, sure. One, it's a pleasure to sit here and speak to you this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on the time you're listening to this, and also to sit with Elder Senoga. I am Kenneth Muhangi. I am an advocate. I'm a lawyer. I'm a practicing advocate. I am a partner at a law firm called KTA Advocates, where I head the technology, sustainability, and intellectual property docket. I'm also a lecturer of intellectual property, and I also chair various committees relating to intellectual property and technology, like with the East Africa Law Society and Uganda Law Society. I'm glad that we started with Elder Senoga to be able to give us context as to barkcloth. So I look at barkcloth as a Ugandan thing. It is, I understand, very, very central to certain cultures within the geographical location of Uganda. And as we know, Buganda, Bunyoro, the Busoga, all the kingdoms that we have in Uganda existed before we had the geographical uh, denotation or demarcation that we have as a country, Uganda. So since we do have this demarcation as Uganda, I view Barkcloth as something central to the identity of Uganda. And as a Ugandan, Barkcloth is a piece of culture, a piece of heritage that means a lot to me, and that I do hope can be preserved not only for my generation but for countless other generations to come, as it was preserved in the past.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I think this is where you meet us in this conversation to do with Barkcloth, actually is where you come in as someone who probably has a lot of kind of foundational understanding for how we bring Barkcloth into the present day. You know, we've been having a lot of conversations about Barkcloth as an ancient material. And then we've been talking a lot about how it's starting to appear in fashion and global industries. And so it seems that there's a complex relationship between intellectual property, or there's definitely a conversation between intellectual property and cultural heritage, because we're meeting it from the conversation of cultural heritage and using it. But what does it mean as a piece of intellectual property?
Very good question. So I love foundations because I feel without a foundation, it's difficult for you to build anything that will stand. And so let's start with a foundation of what intellectual property means, and then build from that in answering the question that you've asked. Intellectual property is a grouping or collection of rights that basically protect creations of the mind. Now, when we then extrapolate that to understand Barkcloth is in essence a material that comes from nature, that comes from a tree. And Elder Senoga perhaps can be able to give more context as to exactly how that process how that works to be able to create Barkcloth. But when we are now protecting the materials or any artifacts that come from that particular piece of Barkcloth, we have a couple of IP rights that we can be able to use. And so each right has a particular grouping. And so generally, as Barkcloth, since it comes from nature, there is no IP right that protects or that gives the monopoly over something that comes from nature to a particular individual. But generally, the main IP right we can look at is what we call a geographical indication. So a geographical indication is basically a right that protects anything that comes from nature, comes from the ground, and that has certain characteristics that are specific to a particular region. So if it is Barkcloth, for example, we know that the type of tree that the Barkcloth comes from maybe grows in a specific region. Since we're speaking to someone representing the Buganda culture, we say, okay, maybe there's a tree, there's a type of tree that grows better in Buganda. And so that tree will get protection, or anyone that then creates products that come from that particular tree will have what we call a geographical indication.
So when we talk about UNESCO recognizing Barkcloth as a masterpiece of oral and intangible heritage and humanity, is this the protection kind of that? Is this the recognition of that we're talking about?
Well, yes and no.
What does that mean to the recognition of it?
So I started with a geographical indication, but then there's also a copyright. So the copyright now is the one that protects artifacts that relate to fashion, being that maybe there's a particular design or there is a particular that is protected under copyright. Now, we do not have a specific protection, IP protection, that looks at Barkcloth as a piece of cultural heritage. That alone, we are proposing, some of us, to have a standalone intellectual property right. So when UNESCO defines or categorizes Barkcloth as a piece of heritage, what they're saying in essence is that, look, if we have all of these IP rights that protect other inventions or creations, and since we don't have a standalone intellectual property right that you can be able to squarely put Barkcloth in, what if we had a sui generis right? Sui generis means of its own kind. So what if we had a specific right that was looking at Barkcloth as a right, as an intellectual property right on its own, but that was owned communally the same way that a geographical indication is. And so that's really how I can be able to make that connection.
So within that, after, say, this is established, right? How does this filter down to those of us who want to use Barkcloth? How does that feed into? So now we have a right, it's protected or in these kind of capacities. So how does this copyright pertain to or someone who wants to use Barkcloth as a material?
Okay, so I think it's also important for anyone who's listening to first understand the different intellectual property rights and understand that each IP right denotes or refers to a specific item or a specific classification, if I may call it that.
Okay, so it's not just the use of the material, it's how you use it that determines if you can have a right or have some kind of ownership over it as well.
Yes, exactly. So that also extends to the process, let's say, of being able to make something. So we know that the ones that we'll be talking about are geographical indication. That one, think of items like tequila. Those of you that enjoy tequila, tequila comes from a specific region, and so it is protected as a GI. And then you have champagne, which is also from a specific region in France. And so anyone that is going to market, brand, or sell champagne can only do so if they have the permission of the body or that owns that geographical indication from that particular area.
Okay.
And so then Barkcloth, like I already explained, would be from Buganda or from Bunyoro or from Busoga, all the different cultures in Uganda that are able to use that. So other IP rights that we have, like copyright, which I mentioned, relates to fashion. You have patents, which relate to technological innovations or inventions that have an aspect of technology. So you can't say, for example, that you can't patent the process of making Barkcloth if that process is novel, involves some sort of technical effect, and can be replicated in an industry.
Okay. So you're saying, so no one can own how it's made, but someone can own their individual product that comes out as a consequence of it. Because I think one of the questions here is that why that question is important is because as we start to see Barkcloth appearing in global industries, like Puma has made shoes with it, Mercedes has used it for car interiors, NASA identified a German-produced Barkcloth as one of the world's top 10 material innovations. And in 2025, it was even featured in the interior design for the G7 leaders meeting in Germany. So we're hearing about it being used in these kind of global industries. What does that mean for us? Because we are on the root level starting to use Barkcloth for different things. So how can we also get into, these kind of global industries through the use of patenting or getting our, yeah.
Act on ownership, patenting. Among the 56 clans of Uganda Kingdom, there is only one clan that holds ownership to the arts of making Barkcloth. And again, of course, all of us from all the different clans can make Barkcloth, but we all acknowledge that it comes from the Otter clan, Ngonge. The Otter clan's people, when we come to the segment that talks about this history, the Otter clan people actually originated this cloth in our kingdom here. So we acknowledge and recognize that if it comes from them, it is of a superior quality. Then we definitely have different types of, there's Barkcloth for royalty, there is Barkcloth for brides. So it comes in different segments. Then there's Barkcloth for warriors. Then there's Barkcloth for sleeping material, Shitentegere, and so on and so forth. I think my partner on that part of the history will come to highlight all this. So when we look at a barkcloth, inwardly, even in its use, we pay homage to both the craftsman, the soil from which this tree was planted, and the Ngonge clan people who originated this.
Yeah.
We, in our African culture, we must make these acknowledgements as we make use of this. I don't know, my friends from the law, whether they also pay attention to this, but we think if you don't pay attention, if you don't acknowledge the maker, then you won't wear it in peace, or it won't give you the kind of energy you need to draw from it. Thank you.
So with that in mind, though, that brings the question that when we are looking at it in global industries, are these brands supporting or appropriating the material?
Yeah, so I really love that. And generally, the reason why we have intellectual property as a discipline is exactly what Mr. Senoga here has mentioned. What intellectual property does is it ascribes or it confirms or affirms that a particular individual or community owns a particular piece of invention, a particular piece of literature, a particular piece of creation. So it ascribes ownership towards something, and so that ownership is enjoyed in the sense of a monopoly. So IP generally, whenever we look at IP, and even when we teach our students IP, we usually start from the Bern Convention or the Paris Agreement. So basically from the context outside of Africa. But again, there are many of us that are now more interested in understanding were there systems of ownership that existed before the modern intellectual property laws that we have. And from what you've said, 100%, because if a Barkcloth in particular is ascribed to a particular clan in Buganda, that means there were techniques that were passed on from generation to generation. And then there were particular artisans within that community that were known, let's say, to be able to make particular pieces of cloth or artifacts, yes, that were quality, and they should have had some sort of protection. But unfortunately, most of this history has gotten lost. And so now the challenge or downside or danger of intellectual property, especially within the context that you've mentioned of international brands or companies using Barkcloth in that manner, is that with IP, it is difficult, let's say, to stop an industry that has created or used AI or any of these more modern tools to create a process that maybe shortens the period through which Barkcloth is made. Because you'll tell us how long it takes to be able to make a particular cloth. But I would say maybe it takes days or sometimes even months to be able to create a particular piece. But let's say an industry in Germany or in the US, shortens that process to minutes by using certain technology. That process itself may get a patent or may get some intellectual property, right? The product also will be able to get a trademark. But that's why we are stressing that if we then had a sui generis protection towards Barkcloth, then it wouldn't be possible for anyone to use Barkcloth either in the processes that I've mentioned or any other way other than first confirming or getting permission or paying some sort of royalty to the community where Barkcloth is actually where that knowledge first came from.
Yeah.
Because before you use it in an industry, you must first had an application somewhere, and then that application is what then guides how other people can be able to use that Barkcloth. So at the moment, that's why we're saying, can we have a standalone law that looks at cultural heritage, of which Barkcloth will be a cultural expression, a tangible cultural expression that can be protected and is protected and owned by a particular community.
Okay, so is this where, because I've heard also a lot this word, with people mention it a lot when they're talking about biopiracy. So is this this is where biopiracy comes in?
Yes.
Can we explain what is biopiracy?
Okay, so biopiracy generally is someone, an individual, country, community taking genetic material or taking well, now in this instance, material that even forms part of cultural expressions, and then using them in other industries or transforming them, creating other derivative works from it without necessarily either going back to the community and saying this is where we got this material from, or paying any money or any sort of royalty to that particular community. So in relation to Barkcloth, we are seeing that there is an appropriation of culture, but there's also the taking away of these methods of being able to create barkcloth or the barkcloth itself and using them in those particular industries, but without going back to the communities. So in our patent law, we do have a restriction where our lawmakers affirm that if you're going to use any material, if you're going to apply for a patent and you're going to use any material that comes from a specific region, you should be able to indicate when you're applying for that patent that I've gotten this biomaterial or this material from this particular area. And there are also other conventions, like recently the World Intellectual Property Organization also had another convention or treaty that looks at biodiversity, and biopiracy was one of the aspects that they looked at. But thankfully, Uganda was already ahead of that, as we already had provisions in our laws. But that still only relates to patents. It does not relate to copyright or geographical indications. And so again, that's why we do need to have these provisions as well looked at within the context of a sui generis law.
Okay. So I see here though that you're showing, well, what you're showing me is the difference between like maybe what is a copyright, maybe what is a patent, maybe what is like biopiracy, all of these things have different sections, like one leads on to the other.
Yes.
So once we have this kind of patent or intellectual property that's acknowledged about barkcloth, now we get into the individual uses of it and what and how people are or aren't allowed to use it.
Yes.
So yeah, I wanted to ask about that. So if an artist is using, how do we use barkcloth as Ugandans, respect the cultural right of it, the intellectual property of it, but also moving forward with it as our own product that we can create our own ideas with, not having to be held to maybe a cultural standard, the same way that Puma is using it in the shoes or in car interiors. Are there ways for us as potential makers of it, how do we protect our rights to use it?
Well, honestly, there is no society or government or system that will work without law. And so law and policy are really at the crux or center of any society or any community. And so without these laws, without being able to ascribe certain protections or ownership or rights towards that particular exploitation of these materials, it becomes difficult to be able to determine how they are used or how they shouldn't be used. So at the moment, there is no law that will prevent another country and other cultures from being able to use that. But also in saying that, I also do see that it's also a bit complex even when it comes to the Ugandan context. And I'm using Uganda here on purpose. Like I introduced earlier, Uganda may be a geographical demarcation with many cultures or kingdoms within it. But it's very difficult to say, for example, that only the Baganda should have a right over the barkcloth, because the Basoga do have it. King Kabalega, one of the most famous kings, was also buried in hundreds and hundreds of barkcloth. And as you were saying, perhaps his body has been preserved for all those years. And so there's also that question that how do we have fairness when it comes to ascribing ownership to particular cultures, or should it be seen as ascribing ownership to a country, now seeing that we cannot really do away with those particular demarcations? We're still Uganda and Baganda, Banyankole, Batoro.
But then, so I'd ask, like in different laws now, like say there's a coffee that comes from a certain country and it is only made in that country, like Ethiopia, and there are different kind of rights put in place to kind of respect the fact that it only comes from there. So when anyone else say they have like Arabica or whatever, it's not true unless they're getting it from the real place. So does that mean that even as Ugandans, that means couldn't we not say that if it's all coming from here, like if you're using barkcloth, if it comes from here, then it has to have,
yes, as I said,
are those things in place?
yes, but that's why I'm saying we need to be intentional about ascribing which community or which people will own that. In those examples that you've given, now there we're going into the realm of a geographical indication, which is much easier because here you're looking at the geographical location, and that can be a country, that can be a particular specific region in a place. But yes, we do need, that's where law and policy comes in, to be able to remove these ambiguities and make it easier for the exploitation of these rights. Because ultimately, if we don't do that, it makes it easier for people to use that disunity, if I may be able to call it that, to then exploit these pieces of heritage. And yet, if we then ascribe that ownership, recognizing that there are particular cultures that perhaps have advanced certain processes that have made it easier or have made it more popular, but where we recognize where recognition is due, and then ascribe rights or ownership that would allow that exploitation in a more meaningful and more organized way.
So I would ask one more question, which is, what steps can Uganda and its artists take to protect Barkcloth kind of from biopiracy and copyright infringements, and what kind of safeguards are there? You know, what can they do to get more rights within like a global economy?
I would say the biggest thing that Uganda can do is by using the law. So I know I'm speaking from a biased perspective, but nonetheless, that's why I'm on this podcast, to be able to give the legal perspective. And like I introduced, if you do not have a law or laws that protect clearly or squarely a particular piece of culture or heritage, then it becomes difficult to be able to enforce or protect them. So as Uganda, I would say first and foremost, we do have already existing traditional IPR, right? That can protect or that Barkcloth can fall under, like I mentioned, geographical indications, or copyright if it comes to fashion, or even patent if it comes to the process of being able to create the Barkcloth, or a trademark as well, like IGC Fashion for the clothes that they make out of Barkcloth. They can be able to brand them, and they, their trademark can fall within that. But all of these, the problem comes in when you have all of these rights that are basically fragmented and that are not unified. And so I would say overall, I would ask that if there was a way we could be able to have one right that recognizes pieces of culture like Barkcloth and say this is a traditional cultural expression, and so it must be protected or must have its own IP right, the way you have a GI, trademark, or copyright.
Okay, thank you.
What can be done? One of the dilemmas of our time is limited information or the lack of correct materials. Most of this knowledge is actually kept in the heads and hearts of the old people who are sadly dying away without giving you this information. For example, about point of origin of these products. Trust me, you don't have to dig too deep to know there's a Barkcloth village in Uganda where almost everybody in that village is a Barkcloth maker. Like we said, there's a Barkcloth clan in Buganda. So how did this Barkcloth travel through the others? The people from Bunyoro brought the arms, the weapons, the metal. They took the Barkcloth. The people from Toro brought the salt. They took the Barkcloth. So Barkcloth was also a form of exchange. This is how it traveled. How did the Barkcloth go to Ankole? During those Fane Wars and Baganda ran away, when they ran to do those planting of matoke, they also went with the Barkcloth tree. Why? No sensible Muganda would plant a matoke plantation without putting a Barkcloth tree there, both for the fertility of the soil, but also to get the material for the cloth. So we definitely can find a point in Uganda where this Barkcloth and where this tree originates. Yes.
Thank you very much, both of you, for being here. I think we have one last question, which is what we always kind of ask each person who joins us. And that is, if there was one key message you would like our listeners to take away about Barkcloth, what would it be? Let's start with our elder.
Well, first of all, I'm not angry that the big corporations are finding value in the Barkcloth. I'm saying, got you, because Barkcloth has got a very bad name right here. So if there's one thing I can say, I would say having a piece of Barkcloth in your home is an act of expressing your own culture, whether for dressing or for any other thing. Get a piece of Barkcloth in your home. Who knows what blessings it comes with?
Kenneth?
I would say that it's important for every Ugandan to understand identity. There's a scientist called Carl Sagan who back in the 70s had released a monogram or phonogram into the cosmos, and that had a representation or had a recording of different ways of greeting from different cultures. And actually, the Buganda featured on that particular phonogram, and the idea was that if there was another civilization that existed outside of us, they would be able to understand the different languages. And so aspects of identity aspects of culture go to identity. And so if we all understood that Barkcloth is not a Buganda thing, is not a Bunyoro thing, or it's an African thing, but it's a Ugandan thing, it's an African thing, that gives us a stronger sense of identity. And especially in a world where there is a lot of disunity and dilution of identity, I feel it's very, very important. And as a lawyer, I would say that the law also has a very critical role in ensuring that these aspects of our culture are protected, and that also we protect or stop other people from being able to exploit them to the detriment of those that have spent generations in protecting them and in preserving them and in creating ways to be able to exploit Barkcloth. Thank you.
Thank you. That wraps up our conversation for this week. I just want to say thank you to Elder Senoga and Kenneth for coming and sharing your kind of knowledge and experience based on what you do from your perspectives. Thank you for sharing your insights on these intersections of intellectual property, culture, and the protection of Indigenous materials. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to join us next week when I'll be speaking with James Bond and Natasha Sima about their relationship between Barkcloth and the environment. For more information, upcoming events, or products made from Barkcloth, check out the IGC website and Instagram, both linked in the podcast notes. Thank you and see you next time.
Thank you.